And we turn now to Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman. He joins us from Orlando, Florida this morning, where he spent the weekend campaigning on behalf of President Biden's reelection. Welcome to the show, Senator.
Hi.
Hi.
Great to be here.
Great to have you here. You're cracking up. Do you want to tell us what you're responding to there?
Oh, that interview, that was magnificent. No,
Okay. Well, let me ask you about Democrats and your own party. I know you've been spending a lot of time on that this past weekend. You've been outspoken about these protesters we were just talking about with our reporter there. The director of national intelligence testified this week that there is no U.S. intelligence that Hamas is influencing the protests in the U.S. or directing it in any way. But I know you have said, while it's a great American value to protest, I don't believe living in a pup tent for Hamas is really helpful. Do you consider the flying of the Palestinian flag to be anti-Semitic, or have you actually seen the Hamas flag in some of these protests?
No, I don't think that, but I will say that these kind of protests haven't been helpful, and ironically, they are actually working against peace in Middle East as well. And it's also very strange to me that now they're not actually protesting for a ceasefire now. And there's been a very valid ceasefire that's been on the table now, and Hamas has been refused to take that on. And I don't know why we're not, if we're going to protest thing, why aren't we protesting that, demanding Hamas to take that kind of a ceasefire? And then that would end all of the trauma and the chaotic going on there in Gaza.
Well, many of these young protesters are protesting against President Biden's Israel policy, Israel being a recipient of U.S. taxpayer dollars and U.S. provided weapons. Hamas is not. Hamas is a designated terror group. So do you have any problem with the attempt to influence the president's policy through protest?
Well, like I said, I'll never support any kind of conditions on Israel during this. And again, I am going to continue to center Hamas is responsible for all of that again then. And now, if you're going to protest on these campuses, or what they're going all across America as well too, I really can't forget that the situation right now could end right now if Hamas just surrendered and they just sent all of those hostages home again. And that's also a thing that I've been frustrated too, is now that those hostages should be really in front of the conversations about the situation in Gaza. Sending them home would really, end, again, all of this immediately.
Well, understood, but these protesters, are you saying that by protesting the president's policy, you just see any opposition to the president's policy as pro-Hamas? Or is it something specific that you have an issue with?
I mean, it's perfectly normal if you don't agree with the president on this issue or many other issues. But it's very strange that when we have this incredible, important election right in front of us about 6 months ago, and it's really two stark choices. You have Joe Biden, an outstanding president, and then you have Donald Trump, who's actually now in a trial talking about bribing a former adult film star. And it's really kind of a stark contrast here. And if you're willing to walk away from Joe Biden, it's inevitable. You're actually supporting Trump.
Well, I need to talk to you about other issues affecting this election on the other side of this break. So please stay with us, Senator. We'll be back. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We return to our conversation with Pennsylvania Democratic Senator John Fetterman. Senator, you said the other day that you'd vote for a Senate version of that House anti-Semitism bill. The ACLU said federal law already prohibits anti-Semitic discrimination and that this bill would chill free speech. Do these concerns resonate with you?
I don't disagree with that. I was one of the co-leaders, sponsors of that bill. So of course I'm going to vote yes on that. And I think it's a very valid concern that really allowed that I mean, that's an overwhelming vote, a bipartisan vote in the House as well. I think it's a great bill, and I look forward to voting for it.
But sorry, just to clarify, you agree with the ACLU saying that it's wrong to equate criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism?
No. Well, I'm not really sure what's really the. I don't agree. I mean, I do think a lot of the criticism right now during this the Gaza war, I think at its root does have some anti-Semitism there as well too. Now, it's you don't have to agree with the Israeli government, but a lot of the protesting and a lot of the words that are being thrown around on a lot of these campuses, are actually very anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I was just, the ACLU comment was on that House bill. That's why I wanted to clarify that. So you, as we mentioned, have been in Florida for this Democratic fundraiser. Our CBS polling shows that President Biden is in a really tight race in your home state of Pennsylvania with Mr. Trump. 61% of registered voters say the economy in Pennsylvania was better during the Trump era. 55% said Mr. Biden makes them feel worried versus 48% who say Trump. How tight is this race going to be?
So we're having a technical issue.
Okay. I was asking you about CBS polling showing a very tight race in the state of Pennsylvania. Are you able to hear me, sir?
It's not working.
Okay. All right, I'll ask one more time. Sir, if you can hear me.
Now it's working. Now it's working. Now I can, yeah. Okay.
Sure. In the state of Pennsylvania, our CBS polling shows it's going to be a very tight presidential race. For Joe Biden to be reelected,
correct,
the issue of the economy is of paramount importance. And in your state, our polling shows there's more confidence in Trump's leadership on the economy than in Biden's. And this is very acute around the issue of oil and gas. How worried are you?
I'm not worried about that. And I want to be very clear. Joe Biden beat Trump in Pennsylvania, and he's going to do that again. But it's going to be very close. Absolutely. I've been calling that. I've been having that same conversation since 2016, that it's going to be very competitive. And now oil and gas, of course, that's an issue, but it's not going to be, it's going to define the race, and that's for sure. Again, we have that two very stark choice between those two. And it's very clear that it's not going to be a defining factor for sure.
Well, we're going to have a lot of focus on your state in the coming months. Senator, thank you for your time today. We'll be right back. We're joined now by California Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna. Good to have you here. And you've been, I know, visiting college campuses across the country, Michigan, Nevada, and the Biden campaign recently sent you to Wisconsin. Are we at the point now where the protesters are becoming a story unto themselves and a distraction from the issues that they're protesting?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in Wisconsin, the issues that came up first were abortion rights. Second, the cost of living and what the president was going to do on student loans and for housing and rent. Gaza came up, but one of the conversations in Madison with Jewish Americans and Arab Americans was extraordinarily civil, thoughtful, and constructive. So I think in a lot of campuses, there are 4,000 of them in the United States, there is actually constructive dialogue taking place.
But the president isn't doing those kind of listening sessions. Why?
I think the president should and will get out there on campuses. I think
he gets shouted down Genocide Joe when he goes to events.
And look, that's part of protest. I condemn any protest that incites violence or that is anti-Semitic. As someone whose grandfather spent 4 years in jail with Gandhi, I mean, the whole point of Satyagraha was nonviolent protest. But we have to understand that this is a defining moment for this generation, similar to anti-Vietnam protests, anti-apartheid protests, anti-Iraq war protests. And they're telling us that over 30,000 people have died. It's time for this war to end. It's time for the hostages to be released that Hamas has. And they want to see leadership in America and around the world. This is not the world that they want.
Well, the president, though, has said the protests aren't making him change his policy. He is unequivocally pro-Israel. It was a month ago he said something had to change or U.S. policy would. Do you expect any change in U.S. policy as a result?
I do, and I slightly disagree. I think the protests and the larger movement have had the president change. I mean, you look at the president now talking about some of the consequences that could have on Netanyahu, the Erez Canal, the Erez opening open. The United States didn't veto the ceasefire resolution in the United Nations after 3 attempts.
And then said it was non-binding.
It said non-binding, but at least, look, everyone from the president on down is aware that young people are upset at what's going on in the Middle East. And I do think it's had an awakening in Washington that this war has to end, that too many people are dying. And if you look at the president's language, it's certainly shifted over the last 6 months. Now, some of us want there to be consequences.
Right. And this week, we know there's this May 8th deadline for the administration to provide a report about whether Israel and other recipients of U.S. military aid are using those weapons in accordance with law and whether or not they are blocking humanitarian aid. Is this going to be an honest accounting?
I hope so. There's an independent task force that has issued the report as well. And already.
They're trying to pre-butt what the administration may put out, because they are pretty clear in that non-government report that they do think there are violations.
Yes, and let's be nuanced about what the report says, because it's actually very thoughtful. They say, look, the Hamas attacks on October 7th were brutal, unjustified. Then they say there are tunnels underground in Gaza, but they say you can't go destroying residential buildings just because there's a tunnel, because under international law, you can't have disproportionate civilian harm. And they detail cases where that happens. They detail cases where residential buildings were destroyed without any military target. So my expectation is that the State Department report needs to have that kind of nuance and detail. And if it doesn't, you're going to have people asking why in Congress.
So while you were talking about very specific policy changes for very specific allegations, you also see at some of these protests things that are mixed in there, either outside agitators or extreme rhetoric. Your Democratic colleague, Alyssa Slotkin, was just tweeting about this protest at GW University. She said there were individuals shouting guillotine, guillotine, and having a mock trial of school administrators. She says that creates a climate of fear for Jewish students. What's being lost here in the conversation?
Well, she's right. I mean, you can't be shouting guillotine, guillotine. You can't be shouting globalize the intifada or Zionists don't deserve to live. What's being lost is that those few protesters who are inciting violence or engaging in that kind of anti-Semitism are diminishing the thousands of young people who simply want the war to end. And I guess I would say look to John Lewis or Dr. King. They, in their protests, were above reproach. If some individual engaged in bigotry, they call them out first and loudly. So I'm proud of a lot of the young people who want to end the war. But they need to show the discipline. And some universities have. Look at Cornell, look at University of Minnesota, look at what's happening at Northwestern. There have been efforts not to have the police in, to have dialogue with the student protesters, to have much more peace and calm. And there are models for what can work in this country.
Congressman, it's always interesting to hear from you.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you for telling us what you're seeing out there on college campuses. We'll be back in a moment. This week, the King of Jordan will meet with President Biden at the White House. Jordan is a key ally of the U.S. and for the past 30 years has had a peace treaty with Israel. We spoke with his partner, Queen Rania Al Abdullah of Jordan, on Thursday. She's of Palestinian descent and an advocate for children. We began our conversation on the impact of the war between Israel and Hamas and America's role in the region.
People view the U.S. as being party to this war because, Israeli officials say that without a U.S. support, they couldn't launch this war. You turn off the tap and the weapons dry out. So there's been anger in our part of the world, not at just what's happening, but at the world's reaction. When we see these violations, human rights violations and international law violations, and we're watching the world letting it happen. When October 7th happened, the world rightfully condemned it and took strong action and strong positions. We are outraged that the same is not happening when Palestinians are getting killed. And so there is the sense of the selective application of humanitarian law and a sense of unfairness, a sense of our lives don't matter as much.
You said people back home see the United States as complicit in what's happening?
They see it as an enabler, you know. So clearly, the U.S. is the country that has most leverage over the U.S., over Israel. And like I said, you know, it is the biggest ally and the biggest supporter. And the Arab world is getting, the rest of the world actually is getting mixed messages. So on the one hand, the U.S. is demanding that more aid rightfully go back into Gaza. At the same time, they're denying that the starvation is intentional. On the one hand, they are outraged by the attacks on the aid convoys, but at the same time, they're denying that Israel is violating international humanitarian law. There's an expression of concern over civilian deaths, but at the same time, there's a provision of offensive weapons to Israel that are used against Palestinians. When you try so hard to thread the needle, you can risk dropping the ball. You can risk letting your values and principles unravel. And that has a deep impact. Either everyone is accountable or no one is. So the next time a country breaks the rules, you know, and the U.S. comes and tries to apply more authority, those countries are going to say, well, you made an exception here, so why apply it to us? I think Gaza now is like a microcosm of our New World disorder, of the breakdown of international norms, of the return of might is right. And I think that's very dangerous, not just for our region, but for the entire world.
Recently, President Biden, just about a month ago, warned Prime Minister Netanyahu that U.S. policy would change if Israel's behavior and conduct in this war didn't change. Do you believe the U.S. is starting to use the leverage you say it has?
Well, look, there's definitely been a change in tone and language. And you're right, the president has been warning and has been trying very hard to persuade Netanyahu, for example, to not enter Rafah. But we've seen time and again Israeli officials not heeding the warnings or counsel or advice of allies. So I think it's time that the international community, including the U.S., really used its political leverage to compel Israel to end the war and to let aid in. And it's by standing up for international law, saying, for example, the building of illegal settlements is wrong and it has to stop. It's by saying that, you know, we are not going to provide you with offensive weapons. It's by saying we're not going to continue to use our veto to not hold Israel accountable when it breaks the law. Diplomatic pressure is also very, very important. So there are many tools that the U.S. has in order to compel Israel to do the right thing. And I think for the sake of our world, the U.S. may be Israel's most closest ally, but a good friend holds a friend accountable.
You argued people need to understand that Palestinian mothers love their children just as much as Israeli mothers. Why do you feel like that needed to be said?
Well, because, you know, for decades, the dehumanization of Palestinians has been an intentional approach that Israel adopted in order to numb people to Palestinian suffering. It's actually quite surprising to see just how deep the undercurrents of dehumanizations run. Arabs are generally accused of teaching hate, and Palestinians as well. But Israelis have actually walled Palestinians out of sight and out of mind. It's kind of reduced them to nameless, faceless security threats that you have to defend yourself against.
To see Hamas as representing Palestinian people, you're saying, is wrong.
Absolutely wrong. And also just to point out that most of the people alive in Gaza today were not alive when Hamas was elected. They were either they were not born or they were children at the time. So absolutely Hamas does not represent the majority of Palestinians. And if Palestinians hate Israelis, it is not because of their religion or their identity, it's because of the fact that they've only interacted with them as enforcers of a military state. They have only known them through their checkpoints and bullets and guns. It's not something that's inherently in them against Jewish people. In fact, I always try to remind people that, you know, we have coexisted, Christians, Muslims, and Jewish people for the longest time.
Well, you know, historians will argue anti-Semitism has been present throughout history, right?
Yes.
And it is hard for people to hear some of what you are saying and not react in that way, where they hear a characterization of criticism of the Israeli government or the Israeli military and see where you're separating from Jewish people. Right. A lot of people don't hear a difference.
Anti-Semitism is absolutely present, and it's been on the rise, it's been on the surge, and it is the worst kind of bigotry, It is pure hatred. And I always say that Muslims have to be at the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism, because Islamophobia is the other side of the same disease, and it's also on the rise. Judaism is a religion of peace. And the issue is when you try to conflate anti-Israeli policy with anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism is when you persecute somebody or you discriminate against somebody based on their Jewish identity. Israel is a state. It has political policy, political parties. So you can criticize the state of Israel, but that's not necessarily anti-Semitism. So when people stand up and speak against the war in Gaza, when they're talking about speak against the collective punishment, when you deprive people of food as a weapon of war, when an entire population is displaced, when there's indiscriminate bombing, that is not anti-Semitism. That is speaking against Israeli policy. And I think it would be wrong to hold the Jewish community responsible for the actions or the policies of Israel.
How are young people in Jordan thinking about this right now? I mean, what is the sentiment in terms of the American unconditional support for the government of Israel?
I have to say, in one word, there's outrage. There is outrage because, for most young people, even those who maybe were against American foreign policy or whatever, or disagreed with it, we always looked up to the U.S., as a country, a democratic country with democratic values, with application of law, with freedom of speech, with, human rights, etc. And as I said, the young people are now feeling extremely disillusioned. How can this be happening while the U.S. is allowing it to happen, while the rest of the world is allowing it to happen?
Well, the director of national intelligence in this country, Avril Haines, testified saying there will be a generational impact from the war in Gaza. And that was also a gesture to terror recruitment. How concerned are you that that is what may happen to some of these young people who you say are just inundated with images of what's happening?
It's not just the people who are on the extreme that are being enraged by this. It's people who are in the middle as well, people who are westernized, people who studied here, people who are suddenly just looking at the world and saying, they're so disillusioned. They're saying, clearly there are different standards, that humanitarian law is applied selectively and that our lives don't matter. And that it's okay for almost 15,000 children to be killed, 19,000 to be orphaned. It's okay for the infrastructure to be obliterated. It's okay to stop the delivery of aid and food to an entire population. That is collective punishment. It's a war crime, and it's happening. And so the young people are saying, I guess the West doesn't like us. So in my opinion, this is probably one of the largest recruitment events that we've seen in recent history.
What you are describing is what Defense Secretary Austin warned Israel about, that you could have a tactical win and a strategic loss in the long term. That's what I hear you saying, that this will lead to more terror recruitment.
Absolutely. Is this war making Israel safer? Is it making our world safer? I would argue, after 35,000 people dead, after the obliteration of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza, after the violations of so much, after the rhetoric that we're hearing, from Israeli officials, calling Palestinians human animals, or saying, when the prime minister says that Palestinians are children of darkness, that they only understand the rules of the jungle, when officials say we need to find a more effective way than death to inflict suffering on Palestinians. How is that making Israel safer? I mean, how? Peace is not about politics only, it's about people. Israelis are surprised when the word genocide is used because they cannot see Palestinians as anything but as a security threat, that they deserve what's happening to them. In a poll
They're traumatized after October 7th.
Absolutely,
Many
traumatized. I understand that. And I understand that because of my own background, that I would identify with the Palestinian side more. And because of that, I challenge myself every single day to put myself in the shoes of an Israeli mother who has a child that's been taken as hostage, or any young Israeli who has been taught and who's heard of the horrible persecution that the Jewish people have had to endure in Europe. And I try to empathize and see where they're coming from. And absolutely, we need the hostages to go home as soon as possible. And we need the war to end as soon as possible so that Palestinians can go back to their homes if they have homes left. So I understand that what happened in October 7th was traumatic and devastating for Israeli society. But the reaction to it has not helped the situation. You cannot just rely on this visceral reaction of retribution and revenge. Israel could have retaliated through surgical strikes against Hamas, but that's not what we're seeing today.
The Biden administration is also expected to report to Congress by Wednesday whether or not Israel's complying with international law in its use of U.S.-provided weapons and whether it is blocking U.S. aid. You can see our full interview with Queen Rania on our website, facethenation.com, and our YouTube page. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.